Please be seated. Well, good morning. When we left everyone yesterday, we were about ready to do the cross-examination of Dr. Denney. Is that correct?
Yes, Judge.
Mr. Perry, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to catch you on that. Are you ready?
We are ready.
Dr. Denney, would you resume the stand, please? Have a seat. I want to again remind you that you're still under oath.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Judge. Dr. Denney, how many people with autism spectrum disorder have you evaluated?
Oh, a handful, maybe 3, 4, or 5. Not very many.
Does the 3 to 5 include Mr. Godijan?
Yes, it does.
How much were you paid for your evaluation that you conducted for the state?
I was contracted to up to $6,000 for the evaluation. That does not include my time thus far in the actual trial.
So that would be $6,000 just to do the evaluations, the testing, the report, the interviews?
And reviewing all of the records.
And reviewing the records. How much were you paid for today's testimony and yesterday's testimony?
I haven't totaled it up, but it's $150 an hour.
How much were you paid to prepare for today's testimony?
It's the same hourly rate, and I think I had maybe 3 hours of record review.
Do you know altogether how much you've been paid by the state of Missouri for this work?
Well, I've been paid $6,000, as I said.
Now, you indicated that you had performed several tests with Mr. Godijan. Is that true?
Yes.
And if I counted right, I counted 16 tests in what you called structured interviews. Is that about right?
Well, I would have to look. I had it listed in my report.
I found it on the second page of your report.
Yes, that is correct.
And do all of these tests, in your mind, help you determine your diagnosis?
Well, they assist. They certainly inform the diagnosis.
You also indicated that you read a lot of police reports.
Yes, I did.
In your preparation for this evaluation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And among the things you reviewed, among other things, you reviewed a case summary.
Yes.
Do you remember what that was?
The Greene County case summary?
Yeah.
Yes, it's an overview of the facts of the case.
You reviewed a case timeline.
Yes.
You reviewed, among other things, an interview of Gypsy Blanchard.
Yes.
You reviewed some reports of 2 cab drivers.
Yes, that's true.
You reviewed some reports of some Gypsy Blanchard posts that she made on ChristianDatingForFree.com.
Yes, that is true.
You reviewed the felony information in this case.
Yes.
And you reviewed a proposed instruction with the mental elements of the murder charge. Is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And then a lot of other stuff. A lot of other interviews of family members and friends and stuff, people that knew Mr. Godijan.
Yes.
And some Facebook messages.
Yes, many Facebook messages.
Now, you also indicated that you had been a staff psychologist for the FedMed for 8 years.
Well, actually, I was working in the forensic evaluation unit for 8 years. I was actually at the U.S. Medical Center for 21 years.
But 8 of those years was in doing evaluations.
Well, no, all the time I was doing evaluations. When in 2000, after 8 years, I moved off of the forensic evaluation unit and then started working in the medical and surgical units. However, I was the only neuropsychologist in the institution. And so when forensic cases came into the forensic unit that had neurologic issues or memory complaints or cognitive impairments, then I was a consultant to that. And so then I would evaluate the pretrial defendants as well. So I continued evaluating pretrial defendants, just not at the same rate as I did when I was on the forensic unit itself.
And while there, you performed pretrial criminal forensic exams when they were court ordered?
Yes, sir.
And that would be by a U.S. judge?
Yes, a U.S. District Court.
And in the last, I guess, 8 years or so since you've been in private practice, how many evaluations have you conducted?
Hundreds and hundreds of evaluations, but not, unless you're asking specific forensic evaluations.
Forensic evaluations,
Okay,
let me
that's
be
different.
specific, I apologize.
I have done not a lot because my clinical practice is my primary activity now, but my forensic work, maybe 15 cases.
And are those mostly competency to stand trial evaluations?
I would not say mostly. Most of the cases I get involved in are actually capital murder cases. I get pulled in to evaluate the defendant at various different times in the process, mostly to identify whether they had intellectual disability or any other significant cognitive problems. But there have been 3 or 4 that were competency related, I believe.
Now, you indicated that you evaluated Mr. Godijohn, correct?
Yes.
And you interviewed him for 135 minutes on January 25th, 2017. Would that be right? Page 14 of your report, I think you get that.
That sounds about right. Oh, yes. Yes.
And you interviewed him then on the next day, the 26th of January, for 18 minutes.
Yes.
And then on the 2nd of February, I'm guessing about a week later, you interviewed him for another 115 minutes.
That was the very next Monday. And yes, 115 minutes.
So that's the amount of time you spent just interviewing him.
Yes, I believe that's about 4 hours.
And then you tested him with these tests that you've talked about?
Yes, sir.
And that was on all 3 days. You did some testing on all 3 days, correct?
Yes, sir.
And of the 17 hours that you've spent with him, or about 17 hours you spent with him, 12 of them were tested, correct?
11 or 12.
And then you then prepared the report, which is dated March 25th, 2017. Am I correct about that?
Yes, sir.
Now, I want to talk to you about this, we call it the Wechsler test. Is that how you say that?
Yes, sir. The Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, WACE, for short.
Okay, and it has a nickname?
WACE. Yes.
WACE, okay. And is that now like a 4th edition?
It is the WACE 4.
Is this kind of just a basic IQ test? A common IQ test?
Basic could be defined better, but it is the most commonly used IQ test.
Okay.
Yes.
And in this particular test, you are looking at a number of things. Verbal comprehension, correct?
Yes.
Perceptual reasoning,
Yes.
working memory,
Yes.
processing score.
Processing speed, yes.
Processing speed, and then full scale.
Yes, there's actually about 10 different tests in this large group of tests, and they cluster together into those different categories.
And with regard to verbal comprehension, you gave him an 87. By him, I mean Mr. Godijohn.
Well, I didn't give him 87.
He
attained
there we go.
87.
You're scoring him up with 87.
Excuse me, please, don't speak at the same time.
You're scoring him up with 87, is that correct?
For the verbal comprehension index, yes.
And that would be the 19th percentile?
Yes, that sounds all right. Low average range.
Low average. And that was a lower score than even Dr. Franks gave him for that, is that correct?
Yes, he achieved a verbal comprehension index of 100 with Dr. Franks, right on the center of the average range.
Then on perceptual reasoning, you gave him an 81, or you scored him an 81.
Yes, he achieved an 81.
Again, that's the 10th percentile.
Yes, just a little bit lower than the first standard deviation below the mean.
Again, that's a low average classification.
Yes.
And that also is a lower score than Dr. Franks gave him. Is that correct?
Yes, Dr. Franks achieved a 90 with him on that index.
And working memory, you gave him an 83, or you scored him an 83.
Yes,
That's the 13th percentile.
correct.
That also is low average.
Yes, low average to below average slightly, yes.
And again, lower than Dr. Franks gave him, correct?
Working memory?
Yes.
I believe Dr. Franks achieved a working memory index of 77,
Okay, maybe I wrote that down wrong. Okay.
and I achieved he achieved an 83 with me, so I think that's a little higher.
All right, I apologize if I had that written down wrong. On processing score, speed, you scored a 74, correct?
Yes.
And that's the 4th percentile?
Did you say 40th or 4th?
Fourth.
Sorry, 4th?
4th percentile. Is that the 4th percentile?
I believe that's about it. I don't remember off the top of my head. I think that's about right.
And you described that as borderline.
Yes.
What do you mean by borderline?
Well, as I tried to explain with the graph earlier, there's this range that is below the average range. You can have the low average, right? Low average / below average kind of range. And then there is this zone in between that and what would classically be considered extremely low or consistent with what we would think of as intellectual disability typically. And that range is classified as the borderline range. That's the name for it.
Borderline meaning not intellectual disability, but close to it.
Yeah, not intellectual disability, but not low average.
Okay.
In between.
So it's even below low average.
Yes, sir.
In your pulse, I believe you obtained the same score as Dr. Franks on that. Is that correct?
On the, yes, processing speed index?
Yes.
Yes.
And then your full scale IQ, you scored a 77 for Mr. Godijan, correct?
Yes, he obtained a 77 on the full scale IQ.
And that's the 6th percentile,
Yes.
and that's also borderline.
Yes, sir.
And once again, that's a lower score than Dr. Franks.
Yes, surprisingly lower and statistically significantly lower, as I mentioned.
And yesterday you told us, you said, the data is what the data is.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned that there's some flexibility around these numbers.
There's some error around them, yes.
And there's some flexibility around these categories as well, correct?
Well, to the extent that they're labeled certain ranges, they're generally not, with the one exception of low average to below average. It depends on who you ask what that's called. So it's very confusing, I'm sorry, because there's different classification schemes in the field right now, and we're actually trying to cohese that into one uniform standard across the board, but it's not there yet.
And yesterday with State's Exhibit 184, which was the bell curve graph, you indicated that 68% of the population has an IQ between 85 and 115. Is that correct?
68% of the general population, yes.
And the mean or the middle would be 100.
Correct.
Half the population, in theory, would have a lower IQ than 100, and half would have a higher IQ than 100.
That is true to do.
And among those 68% of the population, they would not all be clustered closer to 85 or closer to 115. They would be spread out along that entire range. Am I correct?
Well, they are spread out, but remember the curve is like this, so they're spread out from 85 to 115, but they cluster towards the center. So most fall in the center area, but it gradually, the numbers get less and less and less as it moves out. That's the nature of the curve.
So most fall closer to 100 than 85, correct? Is that what you're telling us?
Well, yeah, it's the percentile ranking. For example, 100, the percentile ranking is 50. Okay, 50%, whereas less people fall at 16th percentile, only 16%. That's the bottom of that average.
So if 100 is average and you gave Mr. Godijan a 77, that would be, if my math is right, 23% lower than the average.
Well, it's not 23% lower. I'm sorry, that's a mischaracterization. It's the percentile-wise, there'd be a 23% change in the percentile, but it's not like percentages 5%, 10%, 15%, 100%. But a 77, if it's a valid IQ score, falls in the borderline range.
And that's a significant deviation from 100.
Yes, sir.
Now, you administered an adult Asperger's assessment,
Yes.
and that is, I guess, to determine the level of autism, or if there is autism present.
Yes, it helps inform us into the amount of autistic traits that are present in a person that's taking the examination. It includes not only questionnaires for the person himself, but also an assessment, a rating by someone who knows the person well, like a family member.
Now, tell us what an autism spectrum quotient is.
Well, that's one part of the adult autism assessment. That's the Autism Quotient, and it's the questionnaire that the subject takes himself, and it identifies the amount of autistic-like thinking that the person has. It's commonly used in research as well as clinical practice.
What would be an average score on that, do you think, for all people who take that test with autism?
With autism? An
Yes.
average score with autism. Usually, individuals classified with autism, now, with Asperger's included as part of autism.
Yes.
Because usually it's designed for Asperger's, which is just the mild classification of autism. Usually the score is above 32 on that test to classify as significant enough autistic traits to be consistent with the diagnosis.
And is the Asperger's more or less severe the higher the number gets?
The higher the number, the more autistic traits the person displays in their thinking.
And he received a 28, in your view, based upon that?
Yeah, when I totaled his scores, it was a 28 when I evaluated him, yes.
And you indicated that 80% of the people with autism spectrum score 32 or more.
Yes, that's right.
What is an empathy quotient?
The empathy quotient is another questionnaire that goes into the adult Asperger's assessment. And this is a questionnaire the subject takes himself, and it measures the amount of empathy type characteristics or empathy traits that are in a person's thinking. Usually that's low for somebody with autistic traits.
And then, of course, you administered a relatives questionnaire, correct?
Yes, sir.
And what relative did you talk to?
I spoke with Mr. Godejohn's father.
Which is the same person that Dr. Frank spoke with, correct?
That's right.
Now, what is an adaptive behavior assessment system test? Tell us what that is.
The adaptive behavior assessment test is a questionnaire that can be given to the individual himself, or more commonly given to family members or teachers or people who know the person's functioning in various settings. And it's designed to measure their general adaptive function skills in home life, vocational life, academic settings, wherever, but the ability to adapt and function in that setting.
And one composite of that is called the General Adaptive Composite, correct?
Yes, it's a total summary score for the measure.
Dr. Denney, Mr. Godejohn scored a 72 on that, is that correct?
I'm trying to find it. I know it was relatively low. I'd like to look and just verify that that's correct. If I can find that form. There it is. I have 72. Is that what you said?
Yes, I believe
Yes,
so.
72.
And that's third percentile.
That's correct.
And you describe that as low?
It is low, yes. It's in the low borderline range.
On conceptual, you got 70.
Yes,
That's the second percentile.
correct.
And that's also described by you as low.
It is, yes.
On the social, you scored a 70 for Mr. Godejohn, correct?
Yes, he obtained an 80.
And that's in the 10th percentile.
10%.
And you describe that as below average.
Yes, below average, low average. Again, those classifications depend on
On
the test.
practical, you gave him a 71,
Yes,
third percentile,
correct.
and you also describe that as low.
It is low, yes.
Now these percentiles, the lower the number, the lower the score, correct?
Yes,
So when you say the second percentile, that would mean 98% of the population would, in theory, be above that, am I correct?
that's correct.
Mr. Bodichon, in your view, has a long history with autism spectrum disorder, correct?
Yes,
His school records back that up.
yes, they do.
His Social Security records back that up.
Yes, they do.
And Dr. Franks backs that up, correct?
Yes,
And you concluded that he has autism spectrum disorder level 1,
correct.
requiring support, correct?
Yes, all Asperger's spectrum disorders require some level of support.
Without accompanying intellectual impairment.
Correct.
And can you just ask my next question, or answer my next question? All levels of autism require some support.
Exactly. That's the nature of the diagnosis. If they didn't require at least some level of support, it doesn't warrant a diagnosis.
And the level of support that they receive might be indicative of their ability to be successful.
Oh, it absolutely is. If the more support they need, the more severe the condition is, which the more difficulties they're going to have in life.
And in your examining all these records, did you determine whether or not Mr. Godichon had a particularly strong support system?
As far as his family,
And whatever, any kind of support. But let's start with the family. Did you find any real support system there?
well, I mean, it was a support system. He wasn't living on his own. He had family that were involved in his life. At different periods of time, when he was younger, it was less strong than it was when he was an adult. But, yeah, he had some support there.
But not a significant amount.
I don't know how to answer what's a significant amount. He was in a family. He was getting his needs met. Whether he, not to say he was in an affluent family or a family with a lot of resources, no. But he was in a family.
You also diagnosed that he had a specific learning disorder
Yes.
with impairment in reading,
Reading, yes, and math.
and a specific learning disorder with impairment in math. Now, neurocognitive deficits are a common finding with Asperger syndrome, correct?
Yes.
And even with overall intellectual functioning, with these neurocognitive deficits, it still can be within an average range. Is that correct?
I don't understand your question.
Okay,
sir.
let me rephrase that. You indicated that in your testing, Mr. Godichon had weak attention and impaired mental processing. Is that correct?
Mental processing speed.
Speed, yes. I apologize for not saying that. You also found he had bilateral psychomotor impairment.
Yes, motor speed.
And you felt like this contributed to his poor mental processing speeds, correct?
Yes, because the mental processing speed tasks that we have him do are motor related. So then when I used just a strictly motor speed task that didn't require really thinking, his motor speed was very slow, which tells me that that contributed to his slower mental processing speed. Not to say that he doesn't have slower mental processing speed, he likely does, but the slow motor also contributes to that.
And you felt like his cognitive profile was consistent with Asperger syndrome.
Yes, it is.
And that is now just classified as autism spectrum disorder, correct?
Yes, Asperger's syndrome is now rolled into autism spectrum disorders, but it's the mildest form of it.
And there's no doubt in your mind that he is on the autism spectrum disorder scale, is that correct?
Yes, I believe he has enough autism characteristics that he meets the definition for autism spectrum disorder, mild.
Is autism considered a disability?
Yes, it is.
Is it considered a severe disability?
It can be. Again, autism can be so extreme that children and people are completely non-functional. But then it can also be very mild, where there are people with autism spectrum disorder that are actually very successful in their vocations, and some even famous. But generally speaking, they have some level of disability that they need a level of support, hence the diagnosis.
Is autism considered a neuropsychological disorder?
Yes, I believe that would be a fair.
Is executive function impaired in autism?
Oftentimes, but not necessarily always.
And executive function is planning and reasoning?
Executive function is a little broader, and it's like you'd think an executive. Well, the executive doesn't do the actual nuts and bolts of the business or whatever, but they're making sure that all those departments are functioning at their optimal. So they organize everything else, and that's the way it is in the brain. Executive functioning organizes and integrates the other cognitive functions. So it includes abstract reasoning, judgment, problem solving, mental flexibility, and then these can all be divided into language-based and non-language-based type of skills. Also impulse control.
Does Mr. Godejohn have a neurological disability?
Yes, I would say that autism spectrum disorder is a neurologically based disability.
Even with level 1, which is what you've diagnosed Mr. Godejohn with, without substantial supports in place, deficits in social communication cause noticeable impairments. That is according to the State's Exhibit 185 that we showed you yesterday. Is that correct?
That's the DSM?
No, the State's Exhibit 185, the table with the severity levels for autism that the prosecutor reviewed.
Yes, that came out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but I'd have to see it to verify the way you read is the correct
I'll be
level.
glad to show you my copy of the State's Exhibit 185 if you don't mind judging our approach to witness.
My point from where you were reading from, or repeated, Mr. Perry.
My question was, even with level 1, without substantial supports in place, deficits in social communication can't cause noticeable impairments.
Okay, that's incorrect. You added an extra word that's not
I
written.
didn't mean to add the word can. Let me rephrase
No,
it.
that's not the word you added.
What did I add?
You added substantial. It doesn't say substantial. It says without supports in place.
Okay.
Deficits in
That's
social
wrote down. I apologize.
communication.
Let me rephrase it then to be right. Without supports in place, deficits in social communication cause noticeable impairments.
That's
Is that correct?
Yes.
And even with level 1, a person who is able to speak in full sentences and engages in communication, but whose to and fro conversation with others fails, and whose attempts to make friends are odd and typically unsuccessful. Did I read that correctly?
I believe so. It was fast, but yes.
All right. Mr. Godejohn never paid your bills, did he? According to the information you had.
He told me that he did pay his cell phone bill.
Did he ever have a bank account?
He told me that he did have a bank account. He had one that was in his name, but then there was also another bank account that was in his mother's name. That's what he told me. I didn't verify that.
Did he ever live independently?
No.
Did he need reminders to shower and groom?
I believe that was not uncommon for him to need to be reminded to clean up a little bit.
Just one moment.
Yes, sir.
Judge, that's all the questions I had as witness.
Thank you, Mr. Perry. Perhaps anything further?
Just a few questions, Your Honor.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Denney, within the autism spectrum disorder, you only have these 3 categories of severity, 3 levels of severity, correct?
Based on the DSM diagnostic manual, that's correct.
And so with only those 3 available, you place the defendant in level 1, correct?
That's correct.
The highest functioning level.
It is the highest functioning level.
Within the folks that would be within level 1, how would you describe them?
If we were to take just that group, I would say that the information I have and his interaction with me and the records suggest that he's at the higher functioning edge of that. And some of his scores regarding autism are actually higher than or better than what would be in this categorization. So he's really just barely in the diagnosis, in my opinion.
Mr. Perry mentioned the executive function testing that you did with the defendant. How did the defendant score in those executive function tests?
If I may look,
Yes.
I don't want to speak incorrectly. His overall executive function summary score, which is, again, a summary of all of the little tests that go in that area, was a standard score of 97, okay, on the same scale we talked about earlier, which is a percentile ranking of 42. It's in the average range. Now, that module of the battery includes different tests. One, it was mazes, being able to work your way through mazes with a pen and pencil, which he scored in the average range. The other one was judgment, which we talked about yesterday, which he scored in the above average range. And that's a verbal judgment, problem solving. I read some of that to you. Categories, which would be verbal and to some extent non-verbal concept formation, to be able to pull concepts out of the information you see. It's very abstract. His score was in the average range on that. Then on word generation, this is where you have to come up with as many words as you can think of that begin with a certain letter, or in this instance with this test, you have to put together as many words you can think of using a list of letters that are given to you. Okay, so it's a speed and middle processing task that is focused on generating language, generating words. And he performed in the moderately impaired range on that, the first percentile. So that was a significant deficit for him in the language area. But then in his perseveration, the tendency to inappropriately do the same thing again and again and again, to not stop yourself from doing that, he had no problem with that whatsoever. That fell in the average range.
Overall, how would you describe the defendant's executive functions with regard to abstract reasoning, problem solving, and judgment?
Regarding abstract reasoning, problem solving, and judgment, they're perfectly normal, if not above average in some ways.
Nothing further.
Just a couple. You indicated that, I think you said, if I got it right, that he's barely in autism. Is that what I understood you to say?
Based upon my evaluation with him and my interactions with him and the scores, I believe he falls within the classification of autism spectrum disorder, but he's at the highest level of that condition. But he's in it.
And when was he first diagnosed with autism?
He was diagnosed initially with autism when he was very young, when he had a decrease of language function and a lower IQ as well, or at least cognitive functioning in general. And he was diagnosed with just the other diagnosis, autism. Not Asperger's, but autism. But then as he matured, he caught up in the language areas and the overall cognitive areas to such a degree that the diagnosis changed to Asperger's syndrome. The only reason it's autism now, again, is because in 2013, the diagnostic manual changed and rolled Asperger's syndrome back into a general classification of autism spectrum.
Was there ever a time when he was not diagnosed with autism after the first diagnosis?
No.
Now, in your report, you say about this situation, neurocognitive deficits are a common finding with Asperger's syndrome, even when overall intellectual function is within the average range.
Yes, sir.
Is that true?
Yes, sir.
That's all I have, Judge.
Thank you. Will Dr. Denney be excused?
Yes,
Yes.
sir.
Doctor?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Folks, we have some students in the courtroom today. I want to remind you that the rules apply to everyone, that you won't be able to use your cell phones while you're in the courtroom, okay? All right. So, Mr. Patterson, do you have any additional rebuttal evidence?
Your Honor, that concludes the rebuttal evidence.
All right. Mr. Perry, do you have any serve rebuttal?
We do not, Judge.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the point in the trial where all of the evidence has been presented. Both parties have rested. I have to work with the state and with the defense in crafting some jury instructions for you. If I could see the parties over here real quick. folks, what we're going to do is give you an early recess and come back at 12:30. I'm sorry you had to come in here for a half hour and then be sent away for 3 hours, but at least the weather's nice. So I want to again remind you of what you were told at the first recess of the court. Until you retire and consider your verdict, you must not discuss this case among yourselves or with others, or permit anyone to discuss it in your hearing. You should not form or express any opinion about the case until it is finally given to you to decide. Do not do any research or investigation on your own about any matter regarding this case or anyone involved with the trial. Do not communicate with others about the case by any means. Do not read, view, or listen to any newspaper, radio, electronic communication from the internet, or television report of the trial. And to sort of give you an idea of how the day will proceed, beginning at 12:30. You'll come up and I'll read to you a series of jury instructions. That will be the law that you will follow in the case. And then the parties have the opportunity to make their closing statements to you. And then you will be left to deliberate. And we'll do that back in the jury deliberation room. Okay? I don't go late on deliberation, but I'll leave it really to you. I'm not going to suggest how long you should or shouldn't deliberate. I'll leave it up to you to decide how late in the day you wish to go with that. Okay? So we'll see you back at 12:30 downstairs. Okay? All right. Alrighty. We can recess until 12:15, at which time we'll have the formal jury conference. And if I can meet with the parties, attorneys, privately, we'll go through this informally. So Mr. Godeshaw will give you some lunch, and we'll have you back here about 12:15. Okay? Thank you. All right.